Hey everybody, Alexander here again for 30 Days of Symphony. Well, we're now going to travel from the western side of Europe, from Paris, and not one but two of the more delicious works for symphony orchestra by one of the great French composers, Georges Bizet, to now the other end of Europe, St. Petersburg, Russia, for what is in many ways the most attractive of all of the symphonies composed by that extraordinary group of Russian nationalist late Romantic composers known collectively as the Mighty Handful or the Mighty Five. You may have already guessed it. I'm referring to the Symphony No. 2 in B minor by Alexander Borodin. Now, Borodin, of course, is one of the members of the Mighty Five. The others are the very difficult, domineering father figure of the group, Mily Balakarev, who also tried to extend his grip over a recalcitrant Tchaikovsky, but we'll leave that whole story to later. Modest Mussorgsky, who left us, among other things, that amazing piano suite, Pictures at an Exhibition, later orchestrated by Maurice Ravel. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, the most professionally successful of the group, rose to not only become a very admired composer, but also a very, very admired professor of music. And then the outlier, whose music I'm afraid we'll never get to in this series, because he never really wrote a great work of orchestral music, the rather eccentric composer and music critic César Cui, C-U-I. Now, excuse me, with the exception of Rimsky-Korsakov, who, well, I should say, with the exception of Rimsky-Korsakov, who became very successful as a composer and a teacher, all the other members of the Mighty Five had to do something else for a living. This was literally the first generation of Russian composers who were groping for the establishment of the whole idea of music, classical or otherwise, as a profession in 19th century Russia. Rimsky-Korsakov began his professional life as a naval officer. Mussorgsky was a civil servant. César Cui was a munitions expert in the Imperial Army. Balakarev was trained as a composer, but actually then had to take work as a railway official, and Borodin was a chemist. What we all have this habit of drawing a conclusion from all five of them that they were somehow frustrated composers and they didn't enjoy their day jobs. That's true for all of them with the exception of Borodin. Borodin was a brilliant chemist, a very successful one, and he loved being a chemist. He was very good at it, published many papers over the course of his career, was very respected in Central Europe, especially in Germany, for his work as a chemist. He actually was so good at it that the Imperial Russian government would eventually entrust him with the founding and the direction of the first ever Russian medical school for women. So this man was in several ways a great trailblazer. He did compose, however, fitfully in his spare time. It's the major reason why it took him about 7 years to finish the second of his three symphonies. It was from, 1869 to 1876 that he wrote and then orchestrated this amazing work. It does have to be said, though, that because his whole life was just so scattered in so many directions, he wrote the piece out first in a piano score, because that's what most composers do before orchestrating it. He then orchestrated it, and then he lost the score. So he miraculously found other versions of the orchestrations of the middle two movements, and he had to reorchestrate from scratch the first and last of the four movements of the symphony. But the work was performed and published in his lifetime, and it brought him immense satisfaction for reasons I'll get to in a moment. As I said, Borodin was part of this overtly nationalistic group of Russian composers. For time immemorial, there has been this conflict in Russian culture. It goes on to this very day about, is Russia this separate kind of Asiatic nation, or is Russia simply the easternmost part of Europe? I think most of us would agree that it's something of both. And Borodin, while again he was very much absolutely a westernized Russian, he was also very proud of his own very Slavic soul. Actually, he's only half Russian. His father was a Georgian nobleman, and Borodin was the illegitimate son of this Georgian nobleman and a Russian woman. Borodin was actually brought up as a very, very highbrow serf, what we in America in the 19th century called slaves. But he was given all these special privileges that no one else in the neighborhood could quite figure out. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Borodin eventually was, again, this very admired chemist in St. Petersburg, and in his spare time wrote this symphony. He liked to tell his friends at these innumerable musical gatherings that they would have in the evenings, these soirées, as they would say. He told friends that the four movements of this symphony were really four chapters in kind of an epic saga about great Russian warriors of ancient times. The first movement of the symphony, which is ostensibly in a kind of Western sonata allegro form, but you don't think of that because the music is so rough and rude and pictorial in nature. You're just swept away by its sheer power. He told friends that this first movement was kind of a musical depiction of the great gathering of these Russian warriors out on some steppe, the plains of Central Asia. The second movement is where they are just riding across that steppe, those plains at breakneck speed. It's like you can see this kind of gathering horde in the distance on the horizon, and then they come closer and closer, and just incredible. The third movement is the slow movement of the symphony. This begins and ends with a very famous solo for the clarinet. Just gorgeous, very much in this, what was called this Orientalist style, in which composers like Borodin and his nationalist colleagues tried to depict Russian, eastern territories of the imperial, this Russian empire and its eastern possessions. In one sense, it was incredibly patronizing, of course, of these Asiatic parts of Russia, but it did give us this gorgeous and evocative music, which in many cases is actually based on the folk music materials of that region. In this slow movement, Borodin told friends that with the clarinet solo, he was trying to depict or convey the sound that you get from this ancient Russian version of the accordion. The finale is pure festivity in a radiant, glorious B major, a key that's not easy to play because it has so many sharps. Anyway, as I said, Borodin, while a proud Slavic Russian composer to the core, very much enjoyed the more cosmopolitan atmosphere of Central Europe, to which he frequently visited. It was on one of those trips that he met his friend and colleague, the legendary Hungarian virtuoso pianist, conductor, and composer Franz Liszt. Liszt gets kind of a bad rap in some circles because he was one of the very first kind of rock star classical musicians. He was very dashing, extremely handsome as a young man, and he was one of this generation of kind of barnstorming virtuoso pianist composers who just crisscrossed the European continent, in some cases even got to America, and people would literally swoon at their performances. It was like the 19th century classical music equivalent of like a mosh pit atmosphere. What we forget about Liszt is not only the profundity of his music, which we'll get to later on, but Franz Liszt was just one of the most generous musicians who ever lived. He was a staunch ally and advocate of young composers, neglected composers, struggling composers, and he took Borodin under his wing. And one year, Borodin visited Liszt in Weimar, that great German city of Weimar, where Liszt was the the director of music for the ducal court in Weimar. And they played through piano arrangements of Borodin's first and second symphonies. And Borodin wrote, after the visit, Borodin, of course, wrote a effusive thank you letter to Liszt and requested that Liszt please send him any advice he might give him about possibly making some revisions to this new second symphony he had composed. And in a very famous letter, Liszt wrote back to Borodin and basically said, "My dear Borodin, don't change a thing. Do not change a note of this amazing symphony. It is utterly and strikingly original. No one has ever written anything like it." And that's still true today. So in this performance by the NHK Symphony Orchestra, the great broadcasting orchestra of Japan, this is a uniquely Russian, a uniquely Slavonic masterpiece of a symphony, a work that could not have been written kind of west of Russia. This is the Symphony No. 2 by Alexander Borodin.